It started quietly, like most things that end up changing everything. The house next door had been empty for months, its windows dark, garden unkept. The faint sound of wind brushing dead leaves the only sign of life. Then one morning, the scent of fresh coffee drifted over the fence. Someone had moved in. When I stepped in the backyard, I saw her, sunlight glancing off dark hair that shimmered like silk. She was in her early 40s, maybe 40 at most, wearing a soft cream blouse tucked into faded jeans, sleeves rolled up, tending to her plants with a slow, patient rhythm. There was something about the way she moved, grounded, graceful, like she'd already lived through storms and learned how to breathe through the calm after. She caught me watching and smiled. Not the polite, neighborly kind. It was warmer, almost teasing. The kind of smile that said, "I see you, even if you don't know what you're looking for yet." I froze for a heartbeat before managing a wave. She laughed quietly under her breath, a low, melodic sound that carried over the fence. "You must be the new neighbor everyone warned me about," she said. Her voice was steady, rich, with a playful edge that made ordinary words sound like a secret invitation. "I'm not sure what they told you," I replied, trying to sound casual, but she tilted her head slightly, studying me with amused curiosity. "That you're young, and that you work too hard to notice what's around you." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation that landed deeper than it should have. She had a way of saying things that made silence feel like part of the conversation. We spoke a little after that, about the weather, her move from the city, the garden she wanted to bring back to life. But under it all was something else, a hum of awareness. The air felt charged in a way that made every glance linger a little too long. When she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembled slightly, just enough to show that maybe I wasn't the only one feeling that strange pull. Before she went back inside, she said softly, "You'll have to come over sometime. It's easier to talk without a fence between us." Then, with that same knowing smile, she turned and walked away, leaving me staring at the space she'd just filled with something I couldn't quite name. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the confidence in her voice, the gentleness in her eyes, the way she seemed to carry both strength and sadness at once. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I knew one thing for sure. She'd noticed me first. It took me 3 days to take her up on the offer. 3 days of walking past the shared fence, pretending not to glance at her window, and wondering if she even remembered what she said. On the 4th evening, when the sunset melted into shades of honey and rose, she was already sitting on her porch, barefoot, with a book in her hand and a mug of tea steaming beside her. "You finally showed up," she said without looking up, her voice calm but laced with quiet amusement. I hesitated at the gate, hands in my pockets. Didn't want to seem too eager. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, dark brown and steady. "Too late," she replied, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I laughed, and the tension broke. She motioned for me to sit across from her, offering another cup of tea. Her hands brushed mine lightly when she passed it over. A soft, fleeting contact, but it left a warmth that lingered far longer than the moment deserved. The porch smelled like jasmine and something sweet, maybe vanilla from the candle flickering on the small wooden table between us. We talked about nothing at first, about the weather, the noise from the street, the books she read before bed. She spoke like someone who'd learned the beauty of pauses, someone who didn't rush to fill silence because she was comfortable living inside it. I found myself watching her lips when she spoke, how her expressions shifted between humor and nostalgia. There were small details, faint smile lines, a delicate gold ring that caught the light when she lifted her cup, that made her beauty feel lived in, not polished. Real. After a while, she asked, "How old are you again?" 22, I said, unsure if the number sounded too small in the air between us. She hummed softly. "You've got that look, the one people have when they haven't figured out what they're running toward yet." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Do you know what you're running from?" Her eyes flickered. For the first time, she didn't answer right away. "Everyone runs from something," she said at last. "The trick is learning when to stop." The way she said it made me wonder what she'd left behind. A marriage, a dream, a version of herself that no longer fit. The softness in her tone carried a weight I couldn't name but wanted to understand. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the gate. The air had cooled. Her hair caught a faint breeze, brushing against her cheek. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're easy to talk to," she said finally. "That could be dangerous." Before I could respond, she smiled again, slow, deliberate, and closed the gate behind me. Walking back home, the warmth from her touch still burned in my palm. And for the first time, I realized how quickly something quiet could become impossible to ignore. It started with rain, a quiet, silver drizzle that turned the neighborhood into a watercolor blur. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac, and the steady patter against the windows made everything feel slower, softer. I was reading by the window when I noticed her again. She was outside, struggling with a loose garden tarp, rain soaking through her pale blue shirt, her hair clinging in dark strands around her face. Instinct pulled me out before reason could stop me. By the time I reached her yard, the rain had grown heavier, falling in diagonal sheets. She looked up, startled at first, then amused. "You really picked the worst time to visit," she said, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. "Maybe the best," I replied, taking the edge of the tarp from her hand. For a moment, our fingers touched, wet and cold but somehow electric. We worked together in silence, the rain muting everything else, until the tarp was secure. When we finally ducked under a porch, both of us were dripping and breathless, laughter spilling out uninvited. "Guess you've earned a towel," she said, shaking her head with that small, teasing smile that always disarmed me. Inside, her house felt different, warmer than I'd imagined. Wooden floors, framed photos, the faint scent of cinnamon and rain. She handed me a towel and disappeared into the kitchen. I watched the way she moved, unhurried, natural, like the space belonged entirely to her. When she returned, she was holding 2 cups of coffee, steam curling between us. She'd changed into a soft gray sweater that hung loosely around her shoulders. Her hair was still damp, curling slightly at the ends. We sat on a couch, the sound of rain filling the pauses between words. She told me about her job, how she used to design interiors for small restaurants before leaving the city. There was a subtle shift in her tone when she spoke about it, a mix of pride and loss. "Do you miss it?" I asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I got tired of chasing things that didn't feel like mine." Her honesty struck something deep. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, with that quiet steadiness that made truth sound like a confession. The conversation drifted into softer places, the kind of talk that doesn't aim for answers, only understanding. Our shoulders brushed once, then again, neither of us moving away. I could feel the faint warmth of her body through the sweater's fabric. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine, searching, uncertain, but unafraid. The space between us felt fragile. Not romantic yet, not entirely innocent either. Just alive. Then, as if realizing how close we were, she drew back, breaking the moment with a gentle laugh. "You should go before the rain stops," she said softly. But as I stepped outside again, the storm had already passed. Only the echo of thunder left behind, and something unnamed stirring quietly in both of us. The days that followed carried a rhythm neither of us planned, but somehow fell into. Morning nods across the fence, soft smiles that lingered longer than politeness required, brief conversations that stretched into quiet pauses. It was subtle, the kind of closeness that grows in the spaces between words. One evening, I found her sitting on her porch again, a light blanket around her shoulders, the golden wash of sunset softening her features. She waved me over, that same teasing glint in her eyes. "You look like you've had a long day," she said. "Guess you could say that." I took the step up beside her, the wood creaking softly beneath us. "Then sit," she said, her voice calm, grounding. "Sometimes all you need is quiet company." So I did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air was warm, the world tinted orange and rose. I could hear the low hum of cicadas, the distant laughter of children, the faint rustle of wind against the trees. Beside me, she sipped from a glass of wine, her nails painted a soft beige, her movements slow and deliberate. After a moment, she offered the glass to me. "Try it," she said, eyes watching my hesitation. I took it. Our fingers brushed. That now familiar spark flickered again, just enough to make her glance linger. The wine was sweeter than I expected, smooth and full, like the evening itself. "You know," she said after a pause, "most people don't listen the way you do." I smiled faintly. "Most people don't talk the way you do." She looked at me then, really looked. Her expression softened, the playful curve of her mouth fading into something more thoughtful. "Careful," she murmured. "You'll make me think you mean that." "I do," I said before I could stop myself. Silence fell, not awkward, just thick with everything neither of us was saying. Her eyes flickered down to the glass, then back to me. "You're kind," she said finally. "And kind can be dangerous when people start to need it." There was a quiet ache in her tone, not fear, exactly, but the awareness of how easily warmth can become something more. She looked away first, watching the horizon fade to violet. When I stood to leave, she reached out, fingers brushing the inside of my wrist, stopping me mid-step. The touch was light, but it carried a gravity that words couldn't match. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not rushing the silence." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, and she let go, her fingers slipping away with a warmth that lingered long after I walked back home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her touch replayed in my mind, not for how it felt, but for what it meant. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that asked to be understood before it was named. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where time drifts lazily, where sunlight feels softer and hours blur into a calm haze. I was fixing the old bicycle I kept by the fence when her voice called out. "Do you know anything about stubborn drawers?" I looked up to see her standing by her kitchen window, half smiling, half annoyed. "A few," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Then come save mine before I break it." Inside, her house smelled faintly of coffee and sandalwood, the same calm, earthy scent that always seemed to follow her. She led me to the dining room. Simple, elegant, touched with personality. Books stacked on a side table, a vase of fading tulips, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the counter. It was the kind of space that told quiet stories. The drawer was indeed stuck, old wood swollen by years of humidity. As I worked it loose, she leaned against the counter, watching. "You always seem so focused," she said softly. "Ich glänze her." "And you always seem like you're testing people." That earned a smile. Maybe I am. When the drawer finally gave way, a few papers spilled out, old letters, faded photographs, one of her standing by the ocean with a man whose arm was draped gently around her shoulders. She reached out quickly, gathering them before I could say anything. But I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of memory, sharp and tender all at once. "I didn't mean to. It's fine," she interrupted gently. Her voice was calm, but it trembled at the edges. "Some memories just have sharp corners." We sat for a moment at the small kitchen table. The afternoon light streamed through the window, dust particles drifting lazily in the air. She looked out at the garden, her expression distant. "It's strange," she said. "You build a life, think it'll last forever. Then one day it doesn't. And somehow you still wake up, make coffee, feed the plants, pretending it all still means something." Her words hit harder than I expected. There was no self-pity, just quiet truth, the kind that comes from living through endings and learning to survive them. I wanted to say something, anything that wouldn't sound foolish. Instead, I reached across the table, resting my hand over hers. The gesture surprised both of us. She didn't pull away. Her fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. A silent thank you. The sunlight caught the faint gold of her bracelet, the delicate curve of her wrist. After a while, she whispered, "You shouldn't be so kind to someone still figuring out how to let go." I shook my head. Maybe that's the best time to be kind. Her eyes lifted to mine, steady, searching, touched with something unspoken. Then, just before the moment could become too much, she stood. "You fixed the drawer," she said quietly. "You can add that to your list of rescues." But as I walked home, I realized I hadn't fixed anything. Not really. I just seen the first crack in her armor, and somehow it made her feel even more real. The air that evening was heavy with the promise of rain, but the sky held back, painted in deep violet and silver. I had been restless all day, pacing, thinking, replaying our last conversation until the lines blurred. Finally, without a plan, I found myself walking next door. Her house glowed with soft lamplight, a golden haze against the gathering dusk. Through the window, I saw her sitting on the couch, reading, her legs folded beneath her, a blanket draped across her lap. For a moment, I almost turned back, but then she looked up, as if she'd felt it, and our eyes met through the glass. She smiled faintly and motioned for me to come in. When I stepped inside, the quiet wrapped around me. The faint sound of rain beginning outside, the low hum of a jazz record spinning in the corner. It all felt suspended, like the world had slowed just for that room. "You couldn't sleep either?" she asked, closing the book. "Didn't even try," I admitted. She laughed softly, the kind that sounded more like an exhale than amusement. "You remind me of a younger version of myself, always chasing feelings before understanding them." She stood, crossed the room, and poured 2 glasses of wine. I watched her, the easy grace in her movements, the soft sway of her long black hair over one shoulder. She handed me a glass and sat beside me on the couch, not close enough to touch, but near enough to feel the warmth between us. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes calm but searching. "Do you ever think about timing?" she asked. "How people meet at the wrong moment, but somehow it still feels right?" I swallowed. "All the time." Something shifted then, not in what she said, but in the silence that followed. It was heavier, fuller, the kind of silence that demands honesty. She leaned back, her voice softer now. "You have this way of looking at me, like you're trying to read all the parts I've kept hidden." "Maybe I am," I said quietly. "Maybe that's the only way to really see someone." Her gaze dropped for a second, and I saw the faintest tremor in her hand as she set her glass down. Then she looked up again, her eyes glistening not from tears, but from something deeper, the ache of being understood. Without thinking, I reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her breath caught, barely audible, and for a moment the world narrowed to that single point of contact. But she didn't move closer. Instead, she smiled, small, sad, but real. "You should go before the rain gets worse," she said softly. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. As I reached the door, her voice stopped me. "Sometimes," she whispered, "distance isn't about space. It's about what you're afraid to feel." When I stepped out into the rain, it felt colder than before. Or maybe it was just me, carrying something warm that I couldn't put down anymore. The rain had finally stopped. The air smelled new, like the world had been washed clean overnight. I hadn't seen her in 3 days. 3 long, slow, thinking days. Every time I looked out the window, the space between our houses seemed to stretch wider, filled with all the words we hadn't said. That morning, I caught sight of her again. She was in the garden, pruning the wilted tulips, her hair tied loosely, tendrils falling around her face. She looked calm, but there was something quieter in her movements, something almost careful. I walked over before I could overthink it. "You disappeared," I said, keeping my tone light. She looked up, surprised, then smiled faintly. "I needed time to think. You have that effect on people." I laughed softly, though it didn't quite reach my chest. "That bad?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "That honest." We stood there for a moment, surrounded by the soft hum of morning, birds in the distance, the faint rustle of wind through leaves. It felt strange, how peaceful it was, considering how heavy my thoughts had been. She gestured toward the bench near the fence. "Sit with me." I did. For a while, we just sat in silence, watching the light shift through the trees. Then she said quietly, "You've made me remember what it's like to be seen without having to explain myself. That's rare." Her words landed gently, but they carried weight. "You make it easy to see you," I said, "even when you try to hide." Her lips curved in that familiar half-smile. "You don't know how dangerous that is." "I think I do." She looked away, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. You're young, she said softly. You still have years ahead of you to figure out who you are, what you want. And I've already built and broken most of my stories. I hesitated, then spoke. Maybe what matters isn't how many stories we've lived, but who we meet in between them. That made her look at me again, eyes glimmering with something that was equal parts affection and restraint. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she reached out, her hand finding mine. Her fingers were warm, steady, familiar. She held on longer than she needed to. There's a kind of love, she said quietly, that doesn't need to last forever to mean something. I didn't know how to answer that. Maybe there was no right way to. When she stood, she brushed a bit of soil from her jeans, her expression soft, reflective. You should keep your door open more often, she said with a small smile. Life has a way of walking in when you least expect it. And then, like the first time I'd seen her, she smiled that slow, knowing smile before walking back toward her house. The distance between us felt different now, not like a wall, but like an understanding. As I watched her disappear behind the door, I realized that some stories don't need promises to feel complete. Sometimes it's enough to have been seen, and to have seen someone just as deeply in return.